The first thing Victor noticed was that the corner of the ceiling was gone. Not collapsed, not burned. Gone, dissolved into a fine, sparkling dust that drifted upward instead of down, spiraling into a dark seam that ran the length of the wall like a wound in the air. He lay on his back on a floor that was simultaneously tile and packed earth, cold under his shoulders, and stared at that dissolving edge for a long time before he understood that the room itself was forgetting what it was supposed to be. He sat up. Through the window, or the space where a window had been, the glass now replaced by a membrane of pale light, he could see a city that had no business existing. The skyline he knew, the one he'd spent 8 years drawing and revising and pitching to committees, was there in approximate form, but stacked on top of it, interpenetrating it like a double exposure, was something older. Stone towers with no engineering logic, suspension bridges that ended in midair, a frozen lake hanging vertically between two glass office blocks like a painting someone had leaned against the wrong wall. And above all of it, a sky the color of a bruise, moving. Victor had been in an accident. He remembered that much. The scaffolding, the scream of bending metal, the ground coming up fast. He'd been an architect. He knew the physics of falling. He didn't know the physics of this. Don't touch the dark edges. The voice came from behind him. He turned. A woman stood in the doorway, or what had been a doorway. The frame had partially reverted to raw timber, then to living wood, then to something that wasn't wood at all but dark crystalline matter, pulsing slowly. She was maybe 30, dressed in layered salvage gear, the color of dried blood, and she was watching him the way you watch a newborn animal try to stand, ready to catch, not expecting to have to. "The dark edges," she said again, and pointed at the dissolving ceiling corner. "Where the world forgets its shape. Don't go near them. Don't let them touch you. You'll unmake." "Unmake," Victor repeated. "Dissolve. Come apart. Like everything else that loses its memory here." She tilted her head. "You're an architect." It wasn't a question. "Yes, good." She almost smiled. Just the right corner of her mouth, a small private thing, like a joke she wasn't sharing yet. "We need one of those. I'm Fly. Come with me." Her name, he would learn, had been earned. The squad had 4 others, Phantom, who moved so quietly through the debris fields that Victor twice assumed he'd died. Astronomer, who could read the sky's bruised patterns and predict where the terrain would shift. Tank, whose size and stillness made the chaotic ground seem more solid around him. And Gnome, who laughed at things that weren't funny and never explained why, and was somehow always right about the things that mattered. They had been here for what might have been months or years. Time in the coma space, what they called it, the name emerging organically from their first confused days. The way all real names emerge did not behave like time. It pooled. It rushed. Sometimes Victor would walk for what felt like an hour and find it had been 3 days by Tank's count, which he kept by scratching marks on a strip of leather he'd salvaged from a memory of a workshop. The world was made of memories. Victor understood this quickly, because understanding structure was what he did, and the structure here was unmistakably human in origin, not in logic but in texture. The stone towers that made no engineering sense were not random. They were the dream logic of someone who had loved a childhood history book. The frozen lake hanging vertical was someone's vivid memory of a photograph, perceived sideways, preserved sideways. The ice that coexisted with the glass office blocks did so because someone, somewhere in a hospital bed, had once worked in that building and vacationed in Siberia, and the two memories had sufficient emotional weight to become load-bearing. It was a prison made of people. Victor found that he couldn't stop thinking like an architect about it, even when he wanted to stop thinking entirely. The Reapers came on the 2nd day by Tank's count. Victor heard them before he saw them, a frequency below sound felt in the teeth and the sternum. Fly had the squad moving before he'd processed the sensation, pulling him by the collar through a gap in a building that was simultaneously a factory. Floor and a cathedral nave, her grip unapologetic. Don't look at them directly, Phantom said, appearing at Victor's left from nowhere. His voice absolutely level. It slows you down. What are they? Collectors, Fly said. Alien. They built this place. Victor ran. He filed the rest for later. The chase took them up and down 3 strata of the memory city. Ground level, which shifted constantly. A middle layer where gravity had given up entirely and movement was half swimming. And a high stratum, where the fragments of a dozen different skylines merged into a continuous fractured canopy they used as cover, leaping from memory to memory, from a piece of Tokyo to a piece of somewhere with red rooftops to a suspension bridge that flexed underfoot like a living thing. He saw the Reapers twice in glimpses. They were large and dark and moved wrong, not like predators who had learned efficiency through evolution, but like something that had been told what movement was and had approximated it from a description. They reached into walls, and the walls dissolved around their arms. They dismantled the world to move through it. Gnome laughed when one of them nearly had him and lost his footing in the low-gravity stratum. The laugh echoed oddly in the fractured space, and the Reaper stopped, seemed confused by the sound. And in that moment of confusion, Gnome had rolled, dropped to the stratum below, was gone. Later, pressed into a cave formed by 2 overlapping memories of different mountains, the squad ate from rations. They'd assembled from things the world offered when it was being kind. Fly sat close to Victor and spoke quietly about the shape of things. The Veil Keth had built this space over what she estimated was a decade of human time, though she acknowledged the estimate was garbage. They were not conquerors in the human sense. They hadn't wanted land or resources. They'd wanted something else, something that required minds in a particular state, not dead, not awake, suspended. They harvest pattern, astronomers said from across the cave, not looking up from the strip of salvage he was using to track sky signs. That's what Yan told us before he stopped, continued. Neural architecture, specifically the kind that generates under duress when the mind is trying to make sense of chaos. Creative cognition under stress. Human brains do it constantly. Ours, apparently, do it better than anything they've encountered. Better, Victor said. More prolifically, more stubbornly. We don't stop making patterns even when the patterns don't fit. We make new ones. It drives their collection systems to excess. They keep having to expand the prison to hold all the meaning we generate. Victor stared at the cave wall. The cave wall was the intersection of 2 different people's memories of mountains. He could see the seam, different rock colors, different temperatures, pressed together. Someone had been afraid in these mountains. Someone had been happy. Both feelings lived in the stone. He pressed his hand flat against the wall. He could feel it, not the rock, beneath the rock, the grammar of it, the logic by which the memory had been encoded into this space. It was not so different from reading a structural drawing. Someone had felt something, and the feeling had shape, and the shape had load-bearing properties. I can feel the structure, he said slowly. Fly turned to look at him. When I touch it, the joins, I can feel how the pieces fit. He searched for the word. It's like reading a blueprint, but the blueprint is made of feelings. A long silence. Then Tank said in his measured way, "Can you change it?" Victor had not considered that. He did now. He pressed harder against the wall and felt the grammar of it, and thought about what a wall was for, and the wall, subtly, slowly reinforced itself. The seam between the 2 mountain memories smoothed. The temperature equalized. The fear and the happiness in the stone found a kind of equilibrium, not erasing each other, but becoming load-bearing in the same direction. "Yes," he said. "I think I can." Gnome laughed. This time Victor thought he understood why. They didn't leave the cave for what felt like days. Victor worked, and the others ran interference when the Reapers came close, and gradually Victor began to understand what the Veil Keth had built. Not just its texture, but its logic. The prison was real architecture of a kind. It had foundations, it had load paths, it had the equivalent of structural joints, points where different sectors of memory space were pinned together. And if you could find those joints, you could read the building from the inside, the way you could read any building from the inside, if you knew what you were looking for. The Veilketh had not designed it to be read, they designed it to be inhabited passively. They'd expected the humans inside to persist in confusion, generating the creative cognitive patterns that could be harvested without the source ever understanding what was being taken. They'd expected, in other words, what every prison architect expects, occupants who do not understand what they're inside. They had not built it for an architect. The joints are the weak points. Victor told the squad on what Tank's leather strip suggested was the fourth day. Every building has them, and this building, this entire space, it's held together at about 11 major points that I can identify. Maybe more that I haven't found yet, but 11 I can feel. Weak how? Fly asked. Weak like, if I push them, the load redistributes. The building doesn't collapse exactly, but its geometry changes. The Reapers navigate by geometry. If the geometry changes, they lose us, Phantom said. They lose everything. Their collection grid, their harvesting infrastructure, their navigation. They'd have to rebuild from scratch, and they'd have to do it while we were actively dismantling what they built. Fly was quiet for a long time. Victor had learned that her silences were not empty. They were the sound of calculation. Finally, she said, "And us? If you change the geometry, we'd be in a space that I'd rebuilt. I know my own blueprints." Something passed across her face. Not quite belief, something on the approach vector to belief. "Show me one," she said. "One joint. Show me what happens." The joint he chose was a minor one, a point in the low-gravity stratum where 3 memory sectors converged, a highway interchange from someone's daily commute, a concert hall from someone's emotional peak, a hospital corridor from someone's loss. The 3 were held together by a knot of encoded feeling that served as structural pins. Victor had been thinking about it for 2 days. He put both hands flat on the surface that was simultaneously asphalt, parquet, and linoleum, and he thought about what the space wanted to be. Not what it had been forced to be, but what its component feelings wanted to be if they'd been allowed to settle naturally. The commute memory wanted open space, forward movement. The concert hall wanted resonance, shared feeling. The hospital corridor he felt this one like a bruise, wanted to be smaller, more contained, manageable. He gave them all what they wanted. The stratum shuddered, not violently. It was more like a sigh, the kind a building makes when you remove a wrongly placed column and the load finds its natural path. The 3 sectors separated and then rejoined along different lines, geometry shifting 40 degrees. The low-gravity zone compressed into a single column rather than a field. The surrounding terrain rippled. In the distance, Victor heard the Reaper frequency go silent. Then, after a moment, heard something new, a dissonant, recursive chirping that astronomer identified as distress signaling between Reaper units. "They can't find each other," astronomer said, his voice careful and scientific and very slightly awed. The geometry changed and they lost their grid positions. Fly turned to Victor. "How long would it take to do all 11? "I don't know, days, maybe longer. They'll try to stop me. We'll stop them stopping you." She paused. "What do you need?" "Time," he thought about it. "Someone to keep talking to me. When I'm deep in the structure, I lose track of," he searched for the word again, "myself. I lose the edges of myself. I need an external reference." She looked at him, the almost smile again, more present this time. "I can do that." What followed was not glorious. Victor would reflect on it later, the few times he allowed himself to think about it, and find that glory was exactly the wrong word for what it felt like from inside. It was methodical and exhausting and frightening and, at the level of raw sensation, beautiful in the way that structural mathematics is beautiful. A beauty that requires training to see, that lives in the spaces between the visible. Fly talked to him. She talked about her childhood, her work before the accident, A dog she'd had at 11 that had a specific and ridiculous way of carrying its food bowl around the apartment when it was happy. She talked about a meal she'd eaten in a particular city, the specific color of the light in that restaurant, the feeling of being 24 and having nowhere particular to be. She talked without self-consciousness, with the straightforward pragmatism of someone who had decided this was what was needed and was therefore doing it, and Victor listened with the part of his mind that was still Victor while the rest of him worked. At Joint 7, the Reapers found them. They came in numbers this time. Not the 2 or 3 the squad had been evading, but something larger, a coordinated response that told Victor the Vale Keth had understood, on some level, what was happening. Tank held the first approach single-handedly, using the terrain Victor had already reshaped. Terrain that Tank alone among the squad had begun to intuitively navigate, as if the human body knew, on some level, how to read human memory made solid. Phantom worked the flanks, appearing and disappearing. Gnome did something that Victor, deep in the structure at Joint 8, couldn't quite see, but the distress frequency spiked sharply, and then one of the Reapers went still. At Joint 9, Astronomer was in Victor's ear describing the sky patterns. He'd developed a predictive model for Reaper approach vectors based on how the bruised sky rippled before they moved, and he called them out with the steady cadence of a man reading weather data, as if nothing in the world were more natural. At Joint 10, Victor felt the Vale Keth. He hadn't known they were present in the structure. He'd assumed they interfaced with it from outside, built it at a remove, harvested from it at a remove. But at Joint 10, in the deep grammar of the prison, he felt something that wasn't human memory and wasn't structural material. Something that was watching, something that was aware of him and was experiencing, for what Victor strongly suspected was the first time in its long and patient existence, something approximating alarm. He held his hands flat on the surface and he felt the alien attention focused on him like a weight. He thought of the ceiling corner dissolving. He thought of the frozen lake hung vertical, someone's memory of a photograph. He thought of Tank's leather strip with its scratched marks. He thought of Gnome laughing when the Reaper lost its footing. He thought of Fly's voice talking about a dog carrying a food bowl through an apartment in a city he'd never been to, and the way that detail, utterly useless, utterly human, had kept him from dissolving at Joint 4 when the structure had nearly taken him with it. He thought, "You didn't understand what you built. You built a space out of human minds. You designed it to exploit human cognition. Specifically the pattern making, the meaning generation, the compulsive architecture of how we process chaos. You built it to extract that from us passively, without our cooperation, without our understanding. But you built it from us. And anything built from human material, by something that doesn't understand humans, is a building that can be read from the inside, can be rewired, can be taken apart, and put back together in a configuration that serves a different purpose entirely. You built a prison. We will call it home." He pressed on Joint 10. The response was immediate and total. The Vale Keth presence in the structure surged. Victor felt it like a current, hot and alien, and deeply not human, a consciousness of a kind he had no framework for, that was also, unmistakably, afraid. It pushed back against him at the joint, trying to reinforce its own architecture to prevent the geometry shift. Victor had been an architect for 8 years. He had spent 8 years learning how buildings fail, how load paths under stress behave, how a structure under pressure will always tell you where it wants to break if you know how to listen. He listened. The joint cracked. The load redistributed. The memory sectors that had been pinned there. 17 distinct human memories of remarkable specificity and emotional weight. He could feel all of them. A child's birthday, a graduation, a morning in a garden that meant something to someone who was now lying in a hospital, fed with machines breathing for them, released from their forced configuration and settled to the shape they'd naturally take, if left alone, into something coherent, something that made sense on its own terms. The alien presence in the structure screamed. Victor had no other word for it, a resonance that was not sound, but was terrible. Then Fly was at his elbow, her hand on his arm, her voice cutting through the resonance. "Victor, there's one more. Joint 11. Talk to me." "I'm here," he said. His voice came out rough, far away, like speaking through water. "Stay with me." Dog's name was Mishka. She stole a shoe once, just one, never found the other. Walked around with this single shoe for 3 days like she'd solved something. Her grip on his arm tightened. "Stay with me." Joint 11 was the foundation stone. Every building has one. Not always literally. In modern construction, it's more of a concept, the load point from which all other structural decisions derive. In the Vale Keth prison, Joint 11 was where they had first begun to build. The oldest memory in the structure, the one from which the rest had been assembled. A human being somewhere in the first days of their coma, dreaming of an open field, just a field, green and quiet, going to the horizon with a quality of light that suggested early morning. Someone's perfect memory of a moment they'd had, perhaps once, perhaps never exactly, but had constructed in the mind as a place of absolute peace. The Vale Keth had taken that and used it as their cornerstone. Victor could feel the logic of it. They'd have needed something stable, something emotionally durable, and a human mind's idealized peace was extremely stable. It had the structural integrity of deep longing. He reached for it. The Vale Keth threw everything at him. The remaining Reapers converged on his position. He heard the squad responding. The sounds of a fight that he couldn't participate in, could only note peripherally. The alien presence in the structure surrounded the foundation stone, layering defenses, trying to isolate it. Victor thought about the field. He thought about the person who had first dreamed it. What they'd wanted it to mean, what a human being means when they imagine an open field with that quality of early morning light, not escape, not absence, possibility, a space not yet claimed, a foundation for something not yet built. He gave it back its meaning. Joint 11 released. The structure didn't collapse. This was important, and later he would try to explain it to Fly. He hadn't wanted it to collapse, because collapse is waste, and waste is what a bad architect does. What he'd wanted was for the structure to stop being a prison and start being something else. Something that served its occupants rather than its builders. The geometry of the entire space shifted at once. Not violently, again, a sigh, a load-bearing sigh. The bruised sky lightened in patches, not to blue, but to a color that had no name because it wasn't from any human memory. It was what the sky of the space itself wanted to be, freed from external design. The stacked impossible city rearranged itself, along lines that were still impossible, still vertiginous, still built from the scattered memories of people who had no idea their dreams were architecture. But it rearranged itself with a kind of internal logic, a logic that Victor, who had designed spaces for people to live in for 8 years, recognized. It was livable. The Reaper frequencies went silent. Not distressed silent, gone silent. Victor didn't know where they'd gone. He suspected the Vale Keth had pulled them, had pulled everything, and was now engaged in whatever a civilization does when it realizes the containment structure it spent a decade building has just been quietly, methodically restructured by one of the things it was trying to contain. Fly was sitting beside him. At some point she'd stopped talking and started simply being present, which turned out to be equally useful. He became aware of Tank lowering himself to the ground nearby, breathing hard, Phantom materializing from the middle distance. Gnome, who was not laughing, who was looking at the changed sky with an expression Victor had not seen on him before. Something open and unguarded. Astronomer was writing on his salvage strip, scratching fast, trying to get the sky data down before the moment passed. Victor sat on the floor that was no longer simultaneously tile and packed earth, but had settled on something closer to actual ground. Something chosen, not enforced. He was very tired. The Vale Keth will come back, Phantom said. Statement, not question. Yes, Victor said, but they'll have to rebuild from outside, and they'll have to do it against a structure that knows how to resist them. He paused. Also, I left some modifications in joints 3 and 7 that are. He searched for a word that a non-architect would understand. Traps. Basically, structural traps. If they try to reassert control through those load paths, the geometry will do something they won't enjoy. Gnome made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, an appreciative sound. We'd better find the others, Fly said. There were others. She'd mentioned them, the ones from earlier years, the ones who'd been here longer and had found their own ways to survive. They'll need to know the rules have changed. The rules have changed, Victor agreed. He stood up slowly, feeling the floor solid under him, feeling the strange resonance of the structure all around him still. Quieter now, because it wasn't fighting itself anymore, but present. He was part of it. He'd touched every load-bearing joint with his own hands. In some technical sense that his training made him unable to ignore, he'd co-authored it. The Vale Keth had spent a decade building a harvesting engine from the minds of comatose humans. They had designed it with great patience and presumably considerable intelligence. They had accounted for the chaos of human unconsciousness, for the fragmentation and the strangeness and the creative overproduction that made human brains so valuable to them. They had not accounted for 8 years of structural engineering. They had not accounted for Fly's voice describing a dog named Mishka carrying a stolen shoe through an apartment in a city Victor had never been to, keeping him tethered to himself in the deep grammar of the foundation stone. They had not accounted for Gnome's laughter confusing the reapers at the critical moment, for astronomers' weather reading turned to something no meteorologist had ever tried to read, for Tank's steady weight on ground that wanted to shift, ballasting it through pure stubbornness, for Phantom moving through the hostile geometry like a language mastered. They had not, in the end, accounted for what humans do when you put them somewhere they're not supposed to be able to survive. They had assumed the contents of their prison would remain contents. Victor looked at the changed sky. He thought about the open field at Joint 11, the person dreaming it somewhere in a hospital room he'd never seen. He thought about what they'd meant when they dreamed it. Possibility. A foundation for something not yet built. Let's go find them, he said. Fly almost smiled, more than almost this time. They walked out into the impossible city, which was still impossible but was, now, in some fundamental sense that had no precedent in the history of architecture or of alien biology, theirs.